Fate, Souls and Singularities by Mundatorem Chapter 26 to 28. Chapter 26. Newfound Friends. For the second time in the same day, Ritska released a groan as he awoke. Blinking rapidly as he looked around, he felt a familiar sensation clinging to his waist. He bit back a sigh, earlier embarrassment gone in favor of confirming his suspicion. Lancer. He called out, turning his head to the side to call out behind him. Yes, master. He felt the warm breath of the young girl tickling the back of his neck. He suppressed a flinch. I passed out again, didn't I? Yes, master. Ritska released a sigh of annoyance at that. Not again. Why did I even? He trailed off, mind going back to the last thing he remembered. There were other servants, Romans and a really beautiful woman with a, oh. Quote. Lancer. Yes, master. Is the spider lady still here? She is. Ash replied to his right, head peering up at him. She's behind us right now. Given your rather volatile reaction, Shielder decided to maintain a close proximity to her. Along with Solaire. Ah, Ritska nodded. Who? That would be me. A jovial voice called out to his left. Ritska blinked in surprise and turned the other way to see a man walking in step next to him. If Ritska had to describe him, he wouldn't have been too out of place at a Comic-Con convention. He looked like a stereotypical fantasy character. Although considering his current companions, he quickly found that wouldn't narrow it down very much. I am Solaire of Astora, warrior of sunlight. That was familiar to Ritska. Like Ash. Indeed. Solaire replied with a laugh. I consider it good fortune to encounter a warrior of sunlight, and considering your proximity to him, I assume you summoned him. Yeah. Ritska nodded. He was actually the first one I summoned. I see. Solaire nodded his head, turning his attention back to the front. I trust he has been doing well in his duty. I'd say he's helped us out a great deal. Ritska replied with a wry smile. I'd probably be dead without his aid. I warms my heart to hear that the Covenant still stands strong after so many years. Solaire chuckled, and that they do not forget their duty, even in these strange lands. He sighed. I apologize, we are not in a good position for conversation. You have only been out for perhaps 10 minutes. But the situation is growing dire. Ritska groaned. What else is new? He muttered under his breath. How bad? He turned to Ash. Solaire claims to have been hunted for several days. The Romans under his command share this claim. They number only 10 out of 30. Ash frowned behind his helm. What little Solaire has told me, is that they encountered an entirely different foe to the spiders. The spiders are easily warded off with miracles. Solaire chimed in, they keep their distance during the day as well. No, he shook his head. These abominations are far more dangerous, and that is without the Mad Knight who hunts with them. Mad Knight? Ritska frowned. We suspect it to be a berserker. Ash replied, a brutish monster. From how they describe, Archer has sensed its presence, although it seems to keep its distance, for now. That doesn't sound very mad to me. I know. Solaire replied, jovial nature gone from his voice, and that is what concerns me. It could very well be that it doesn't wish to fight us all at once, or it's waiting for a better opportunity. Gareth surmised. Ritska flinched again as her breath tickled his neck. Where's Mash? Ritska noticed, looking around for the other Shielder servant. She is with Shielder. Ash provided, they consider it their duty to keep you, well, keep the demon from your sight. Quote. Demon. Ritska looked around. I know she isn't quite, well, she's certainly a little. I mean demon in a literal term. Ash cut him off. Although she is a good deal more intelligent than the other agents of chaos I encountered. He huffed, she seemed to recognize Sif well enough. In fairness, I can recognize the companion of Esser Artorias. Solaire commented, slight reverence in his tone, although I would never have imagined to meet his great wolf. So, she's a demon? Ritska asked, now looking far more pale, like an actual demon. Yes. Solaire nodded, a demon from Izalith. Given her identity, it was actually her family that birthed demons to begin with. He shrugged, or the demons from my own world anyway. He looked up at Ritska, given your pale features, I assume demons are far rarer where you are from. Yes, the young man numbly nodded his head, I've never actually met one. Yes you have. Ash cut him off, looking up at him with a slightly tilted helm. I have. I did not call Lev a demon as an insult to him. Ash explained, I meant it in a more literal term. I am not familiar with his type of demon, however they cannot hide their presence from unkindled and undead. Wah! Ritska slumped back slightly. Lev is an actual demon. I guess that kind of explains why he hates people so much, and why he was using the Grail to incinerate human history. I apologize. Ash shook his head. I did not intend to cause you discomfort. That was my error, I wasn't clear enough. It's not your fault, Ash. Ritska waved him off, although his eyes were unfocused as he still looked ahead, it's just. We're dealing with an actual demon and not some madman. I think that's just dawning on me. Shall I send for Squire Kyrilight? Ash asked. I understand the two of you have a more intimate relation. Perhaps she can comfort you. Sure, he nodded slowly. Does she know about the demon wait. Intimate. His head snapped to the saber servant. What do you mean, intimate? I meant she is a close friend. Ash stared back at him through his helm. She also cares for your well-being a great deal. I assumed you were both friends. His shoulders slumped slightly. Was I mistaken? No. Ritska argued back, waving his hands around frantically. I just thought you were implying something. We're friends. Just friends. You sure? Arash teased as he dropped down ahead of them. I could swear she was courting you. How close she gets sometimes. He trailed off with an amused smile at the implication. No. Ritska blushed bright red, earning a laugh from the archer and Solaire as well as Sif, the wolf snorting in amusement. Verndari and Ryder Pav. Must you glare at me? Ryder sneered in annoyance at Verndari. I thought you'd realize I wasn't planning anything by now. I have little reason to trust the word of a demon. Verndari replied, in an equally venomous tone, and I have yet to personally witness any act which could facilitate a modicum of faith in your goodwill. I stopped you getting harassed by freaks, didn't I? She shrugged, then smirked. Besides, the sunlight fanatic seems to have faith in me. Who the warrior of sunlight places his trust in, is not my concern. Verndari looked away from her. I have equal reason to believe he merely keeps you around because of your usefulness. TCH. Ryder clicked her tongue, rolling her eyes as she did. I can't stand uppity knights like you. You can't even have an original thought if your king doesn't want you to. She paused, then leered over the knight. Did I say king? I meant slave master. Verndari's shoulders trembled, his helmet hiding that expression of absolute rage. You should choose your next words carefully, beast. He replied in a cold tone, although the edge in his voice made it clear he was holding himself back. Another insult against my liege, and I shall act upon my original thoughts, as they were, and cleave your monstrous head from your wicked body. An act against the one who holds your leash. Ryder replied in a sickly sweet tone, my. I wonder if your owner is aware he has such a disloyal soldier under his command. Verndari released a breath, which sounded more like a growling hiss as his hand slowly went for his sheathed blade. Ryder watched the movement with an amused eye, her own hands flickering with chaos flames. The Romans around them paused and watched the pair nervously, some beginning to pick up their pace to get away from them. Shielder San. Mash's voice cut through the tension. Verndari turned to see the lilac-haired girl staring at him in concern. I can take over from here, I think Senpei is awake now. Verndari cast a single glance at Ryder, before he looked back at Mash and nodded his head once. Perhaps that is for the best. Watch this thing well, Squire Kyrilight. He marched to the head of the column. It has a poisonous tongue. Be sure to send the boy my regards. Ryder called out to him in a mocking tone. I'd hate for him to think I was anything but benevolent. Verndari didn't reply. Mash frowned before turning to Ryder. The servant merely rolled her eyes at Mash's glare. Why did you provoke him like that? Mash asked, furrowing her brows. Because it's funny. Ryder replied in a carefree tone. Because watching all those chivalrous knights lose themselves to rage is ironic. She smiled at Mash's confused expression. If you hadn't come along when you did, he would have flung himself at me like the beast he claims me to be. Her smile took on a dark tone. And isn't that just the funniest thing in the world? Not really. Mash replied, shaking her head. Ryder huffed, staring down at Mash in the same way one would stare down at a toddler saying their first words. You'll get there eventually. She cupped her chin with a thoughtful expression, looking Mash up and down. You haven't been doing this too long. You don't really carry yourself like a knight. Mash flinched at the sentence, causing Ryder to let out a disappointed scoff. It wasn't an insult. She shook her head. I'm rather glad. I've had my fill of knights on both ends of the spectrum. Dogs who know only to bark at their masters, women do-gooders who jump into every crisis to help people. What's wrong with helping people? Mash frowned at the rider. The servant looked down at Mash with a tired expression. Because they never help the right people. She looked away. So, fear of spiders, She chuckled. That boy is in for a real treat. Senpei will manage. Mash affirmed. He'll get through it. Oh. Ryder's grin turned cat-like, and I'm sure he'll be most thankful for his little knight helping him. She turned her body towards Mash, leaning down and causing the girl to blush as her hair fell away from her chest. At every step. Perhaps we should find you some clothes. Mash changed the topic, looking away in embarrassment. Ryder rolled her eyes. And what would you propose I wear? An old tunic. She shrugged. Besides, the clothes would catch fire anyway. How about a flame-resistant sweater? A what? Ryder looked down at her. Master Group Pav. How far are we from your fort? Ritska eventually asked Solaire. The knight made a thoughtful sound before he eventually replied. Perhaps a day's journey. He looked over the Roman soldiers behind them, the dozen or so that were left, however, that would be for myself. I cannot leave the men behind. I shall say 2 days. How did you even end up as a? Ritska snapped his fingers, trying to remember the word, a prefect. Yes, a prefect. Solaire looked up at him, then released a mirthful chuckle. Yes, I suppose it would be rather strange. I was summoned outside of the city of Rome, during the early days of the offensives. He shook his head. The situation was far worse then. Attacks on the city were regular. Upon my summoning, and seeing the danger the people were in, I lent my aid in the defense of the city. We were eventually able to push them back, although offensives into Gaul are virtually hopeless. He gestured to the forest. This is as far as we dared venture, and only because Cecilia had spoken to the emperor. Cecilia. Ritska quizzed. Ah. Solaire made a noise of realization, the emperor's. Well, court magician. And apparently wife. He shrugged, then chuckled. Although making a firekeeper a spouse was certainly a new one for me. Ash choked on air and Sif snorted. That was my reaction as well. Solaire continued on. She is quite friendly though. Although a rarity, few firekeepers are as able-bodied as her. Quite uncommon. Ash muttered under his breath. Then Cecilia directed you here. She did. He replied. She used her foresight to see a potential ally. So I took some soldiers and went north. He threw a thumb behind him, where I encountered her. I fear for your situation, if that is your ally. Vrindari spoke up as he joined the conversation. It is dire. Solaire continued on, however, despite her temperament. Ryder has been most helpful in our journey back towards safety. HMPH. Vrindari grunted, then looked up at Ritska, still riding Sif. I see you have recovered. Well, Ritska gave a wry smile, as best you can after seeing a cross between a woman and a spider. Still. Vrindari went on, I am relieved to see you are not too grossly affected by her visage. Squire Kyrilight is watching her currently. His head turned to the side. Loath as I am to admit it, my temper may get the better of me should I linger around her. She has that effect on people. A Roman centurion muttered from the side of Solaire, then man looked tired, likely from having run for nearly a full day straight. The man looked over the group, then back to Solaire with a frown. I mean no disrespect, prefect, but all we have encountered in our journey north has been servants of the demons. He gestured to the group. How do we know they are not affiliated with them? I understand your concern, Aulus. Solaire placed a hand on his shoulder. However, should they have wished it, we would have died. Besides, those who are of the Sunlight Covenant or those who contract them, would never stoop low enough to work with such creatures. We're just here to help. Gareth piped up from behind Ritska. The boy jolting Haven forgotten she was there to begin with. Honest, we don't mean any harm. The centurion looked up at her, then raised an eyebrow. Why is that child riding a giant wolf? Hey. Gareth frowned. I'm not a child. I'm 20. Really? This time Ash turned around, looking up at her through his helmet. You actually look quite young. Thank you. Gareth nodded her head, looking quite smug. You're not one to talk, Ash. Ritska sighed. You barely look older than me. I'm probably not. Ash shrugged his shoulders, his helmet fading away into motes of light, revealing his face. Feels strange, to be without a helmet. Huh. Gareth narrowed her eyes, peering down at the blonde-haired servant with emerald eyes. You look a bit like Big Brother Gawain. Ash blinked, then looked up at the girl. Really? Dismissing the thought, his helmet returned to his head. I haven't seen my reflection all that much, I shall take your word for it. That's kind of weird. Gareth went on, still frowning in thought. You could probably pass yourself off as a relative of mine. How old were you? No idea. Ash shrugged. I wasn't risen with all my memories, thus I only have the time I was functional to go off. Therefore it would be, perhaps, a few weeks. He shook his head. Perhaps longer, perhaps shorter. Measuring time in Lothric is difficult. Peculiarities of his visage aside. Verndari interrupted, although his helm was also looking at Ash. I am curious as to what we shall do when we arrive at their fort, my liege. I would be happy to explain what little of the situation I can to you. Solaire offered, although I confess, I am curious as to why you are here to begin with. Ah, that. Ritska winced. We should probably explain that when we are at your fort. Basically, we're from a place called Chaldea and we're here to help. Aulus looked at Ritska, then at their group, then back at Ritska before a relieved smile made its way onto his face. I am praying to Fortuna that you speak the truth. She knows we could do with some luck. He let out a breath. I shall speak with the men. He grimaced. We have gotten little rest, Prefect. I do not know how much further they can march. Solaire turned away, Helm looking up at the sky as he made a thoughtful noise before turning to Ritska. You said you had a scout up ahead. Archer and Castor were up ahead. Ritska explained. Ash had explained that Beatrice had virtually leapt at the possibility of being as far away from Ryder as possible. For how much further does the forest continue? I'll check. Ritska replied, then sent out a mental message. Ash. How much further until we are out of the forest? Goes on for perhaps another half mile. At your current pace, I'd say you'll be out in just under 10 minutes. Arash replied, then his voice took on a more serious tone, but I'd advise speeding up. That servant signature behind us had been gaining, and considering they are making no attempt to hide their presence, I'd say they are a berserker. Damn. Ritska cursed. Archer says we'll be out of the forest soon, but there's an enemy servant closing in on us. The knight. Solaire clicked his tongue. He has been harrying us for some days now. The fire seemed to scare him off, but he's never engaged us outright. If he's approaching now, he'll likely have minions. What can you tell us about him? Bestial. Hunched on all fours, acted more like a dog than a warrior. He wielded a large mace in his left hand. Solaire replied, I understand why he was sent against the rider though, his affinity towards cryomancy makes him her natural opposite. Cryomancy. Ash's head snapped to him, that narrows it down. He looked to Ritska, unless there are warriors from your own world who wielded ice. Ritska shook his head, none that I can think of. Probably an outrider knight then. Ash grunted in annoyance. Solaire is right, a dangerous foe to be sure. Servants of Suli Vaughn, twisted beyond recognition and sent out to do his bidding. Any specific ones? There is Vort. Ash replied, although there was another, although she was less attuned with the element of ice. Vort would fit the description. He shook his head. I would assume a berserker servant. How dangerous? It would depend. Ash shrugged. He is bestial. There were very little tactics in his swings. Although he had strength to make up for his lost talent. His body permeated ice regularly, that would slow you down. Then there was the face. He would release cold breaths. He looked over the assembled group, with what we have on hand. I am confident we could defeat him handily. Which is why I am concerned. Why? Because the Knight's master would know this too. Verndari surmised, throwing away a soldier on a suicide mission is the hallmark of a fool. Meaning that Vort's master likely has something that makes him confident in victory. He cupped his metal chin with his gauntlet. Can Archer detect anything else? Arash. Ritska called out. Is it just the servant? No, Arash replied after a few moments, audible concern in his voice. I don't know what they are, they have a presence to them. Pretty strong too, not at the level of a servant but way stronger than you'd expect. Archer says there's other stuff with the servant. Ritska turned back to the group, Solaire stilled. We have to go. He said with great urgency, if Berserker is attacking with the abominations this time, his head snapped back to the end of the column. Run. He virtually shouted, Berserker is closing on us with the beasts. Run. It was as if new life was breathed into the Romans. One moment the legionnaires had been trudging along, barely conscious, and in the next, they virtually flung themselves forwards, propelled by some unknown force as they barreled without restraint, expressions of panic on their face. They'll corner us in the forest. Solaire turned back to Ritska, and Ryder cannot fight effectively in this enclosed space. Ritska jolted slightly, then carried on with Solaire's cry. He sent out a mental command to all his servants, Archer says we're going to have company. Everyone run forwards. Ritska had only just finished calling out, when Sif accelerated, Ash and Vrindari sprinting alongside the wolf. Solaire having stayed behind to keep pace with the Solidars. Then he heard it. A scream that sounded like grinding metal mixed with one of torment. Ritska dared to look back, ignoring the sight of Ryder's spider-like appearance barreling through the forest and Mash running to catch up to them. He looked past them both. And heard trees being upended, snapping of wood and the ground shifting. He began to sweat and turned back around, biting his lip as the scream went off again. That's Vort's cry. He vaguely heard Ash shout out, confirming who they were dealing with. Ash's confirmations that they could deal with the Berserker bringing some small comfort to him. Then he heard a different cry. This one was a combination, he heard a dozen different screams at once. Men, women, children. All shrill and soul-wrenching, the cry reverberated through his body. This time he dared not look back, even as the screams got closer and the sounds of trees being shattered drew closer. He didn't turn. Because he was afraid he see what was the cause. And afraid it would be far worse than how Ryder looked. Gareth must have felt his panic, because her arms protectively wrapped themselves around him. Don't worry, Master, she assured, her tone sounding confident, we're here to protect you. Right now, he didn't care about their proximity to him. He just welcomed any kind of comfort. Although a small part of him wished it had been Mash. Ash sent another glance over his shoulder, the first scream had been Vort. He was certain of that. The second one, he had no idea what that was. He sent a quick glance at his master, and he didn't blame the boy for the reaction. Ash had seen many things in Lothric and heard the battle cries of many of them. Whatever had made that scream, Ash wasn't exactly in a rush to meet it himself. For Ritska, who was still a novice in battle, he dared not think so. Turning back ahead, he saw the trees begin to thin out, the forest parting and revealing the field they were used to. The ensemble of servants were the first to breach the treeline and move into the open, Sif pivoting his body to face the direction of the woods. The Romans in were swift to follow them, desperate and fearful expressions on their face as they rushed past the servants before spinning around. Planting their shields in the ground and drawing their swords, they glared at the forest. Ryder, Mash and Solaire were quick to emerge after them, Mash sending a comforting smile Ritska's way as he leapt off of Sif. The lilac-haired girl rushing over to him. Protect our liege, squire. Vrindari called out to her, holding up his mirror-shaped shield and drawing a long steel sword, barbed steel wire coiled around the hilt of the blade. The other servants all drew their weapons. Ryder withdrew a nasty-looking bone-like sword, fire leaking from the blade and a scowl on her lips. Ritska gulped as he caught sight of trees being upturned, a visible chill blew out from the woods themselves. Mash planted herself in front of Ritska, shield held out protectively. They're here. Arash stated, drawing an arrow and narrowing his eyes. Beatrice gulped next to him and held out her staff, the end glowing a bright blue as she prepared a sorcery. The woods exploded outwards, chunks of debris from shattered trees were flung in every direction. Mash held out her shield and grunted as she intercepted a lump of wood the size of Ritska's torso from slamming into the boy. Said master released a slight squeal of fear. Then he heard it, the heaving metallic breathing. The chilled fog rolled out of the woods, as did the clumping of metal. Ritska peeked out from behind Mash as the berserker servant emerged. Hunched over on all fours and limbs bent in such an angle to make him appear more like a dog, the knight in twisted silver armor crawled out. The jagged helm scanned over the servants, the heavy breaths were accompanied by puffs of chilled air. Ritska was more in awe at the size of the servant. Hunched over he was as large as Ryder's spider torso, that and he was wielding a mace as large as Ritska was tall. The helm continued to scan the servants until it fell upon Ryder. The berserker abruptly froze, the eye sockets in his helm glowed an eerie blue. He threw back his head. Quote exclamation mark quote. And released a roar, the scream sounded like grinding metal mixed with a wail. Ritska's hands went to his ears, the deafening noise even had Mash wince in front of him. The Roman soldiers behind them also did similar acts, their heads hanging low and releasing cries of pain as the scream burst their ears. When Vort stopped screaming, his head lowered. Then Ritska looked up, and wished he hadn't. From the woods, more creatures emerged. He felt bile climb up his throat at the sight of them, the smell was rancid. They permeated a foul stench of rotting flesh. Standing around the size of Vort, were 3 furred creatures. Hunched over bodies, with legs which bent forwards at 3 joints, the creatures stepped out from the woods to join the berserker. Their heads were lined with a black, scraggly hair which continued down their bodies in patches. Glowing yellow eyes darted around as each one stepped forwards. Their mouths occasionally snapping, making a chittering sound as sharpened, crooked, yellow teeth ground against each other. Then there was the pincers which covered their mouths. Hanging over the freakish maw were more teeth attached to limb-like protrusions. They weren't quite long enough to cover the whole mouth, which caused them to cover the cheek section. The legs were arching, segmented like an insect's, ending in toed feet which looked like hoofs. That alone would have frightened him. What was truly horrifying though, was what lined the monsters' bodies. Where the patchy fur didn't cover the torso, there were rows of body parts. Human body parts fused to the creature like a disturbing jigsaw puzzle. Arms, legs and heads of different sizes all mismatched together. Then Ritska felt the world around him freeze. The body parts were still moving. The creature closest to the berserker had a whole torso rise up, left arm hanging limply from a few scraps of skin while the right one was extended outwards towards the group. Then the monsters threw back their heads and screamed. What terrified Ritska, to the extent he would forever remember this moment, was the fact the monsters never opened their mouths, those freakish jaws never widened. For it wasn't the beasts which screamed. It was the human heads melded to their bodies which cried out. Ritska was vaguely aware of Mash trying to get his attention, but he didn't care about that. All he could focus on was the creatures. He could feel it, all over his body. An itching sensation. As if the eyes on every single one of those people were staring at him, penetrating his soul with their gaze. NPAI. He blinked, mutely, his head traveling to Mash with a dumbfounded expression. Your orders. Senpai. He looked back at the beasts, and abruptly froze. They were all looking at him. Berserker, the beasts and the human heads. All stared down at him. He felt his world shrink around him, a coldness crept into his body and gripped his heart. Vrindari's head looked, and he cursed under his breath. His liege was in shock, not that he blamed him. Even with all his experience, Vrindari had never seen such foul abominations. But without command, they'd be in disarray. He had to act. Archer. Target their eyes, blind them. He cried out, Caster, support him with distance spells. Ash and Rider, use pyromancy on Berserker. Saber. You and I shall do our best to draw their attention from the soldiers. Lancer, use the wolf and perform his hand run. Squire. Protect our liege. Quick and concise, he received his affirmations from the group. Go. Then charged forwards. Our first encounter with Aldrich's creatures. Yes, those were deep accursed. Looked up pictures, their bodies had skulls and stuff on them. So I assumed that a more recent creation would have a more fresh appearance. It is no less grisly, mind you. Anyway. We've encountered Vort now. So here's his stats. Vort of the Boreal Valley. Servant. Berserker. Strength. A. Endurance. B. Agility. B. Mana. C. Luck. D. Noble Phantasm. B. Cooler Boreal or Wind. B. Anti-Team. Max Target. 50. Max Range. 0 to 30. Creates a vortex of frozen winds which continually slow those caught in it, eventually freezes them solid. Class skills. Mad Enhancement. C. Magic Resistance. E. Personal skills. Cryomancy. C. Basic Mastery over Ice, lacks intelligence to wield it like other weapons. Therefore is only able to use basic spells to affect his environment. Instant Teleportation. C. Can move from one location to another via portals. Long process, taking nearly a full minute to open a portal and move through. Outrider Knight. B. Immune to poison and cryomancy. In case you were wondering about dialogue. Think of Heracles and you've pretty much got it in one. I would also like to announce I now have Space Battles account and will begin cross-posting stories there. Gradually. It's under the same name as my account here, and the same profile picture. In case you have questions or whatever. Chapter 27. Face the Nightmares. The second the cry left Vrindari's lips, Arash had already released his arrows. They whistled through the air for all of a few seconds before they buried themselves into the glowing orbs of the nearest beast to him. The creature screamed in rage as it thrashed its head around, frantically slamming it into the ground to remove the projectiles from its eyes. That had been the signal for the others. Vort flung himself forwards, clearing the distance between the two groups in a split second, mace dragging along the ground. The berserker had already set his sights on his target. Arash widened his own eyes in alarm, already knocking an arrow to intercept the mad servant before it could bring its weapon down on his master, the kid still in a daze. He needn't have bothered. The second that Vort had gotten to within a few feet of Mash, Vrindari had rammed his great shield into the side of the knight's head. Vort released a howl of anger as Vrindari sent him stumbling. Quickly shooting a glance at Mash, he nodded once to her before focusing on the berserker servant again. That guy, Arash chuckled, then steeled his expression as he knocked more arrows and refocused on peppering the creatures. Even he couldn't blame his master for the reaction to them. They were, without a doubt, the most disgusting things he had ever seen in his life. Vort stumbled. The shock of the shielder strike to his face had his head snapped to the side. Blind rage quickly took hold of his body as blue eyes glared down at the knight. The berserker drew his mace across himself before lashing out in a backhanded strike. The weapon slamming into the shield with a resounding clang. Vrindari released a grunt of exertion as the force had his legs buckle and dig into the dirt, the ground beneath his feet cracking ever so slightly. He released a cry as he pushed the weapon off to the side and thrust forwards with his sword, strike aiming at the underside of the berserker's weapon arm. Vort was evidently not as insane as he had hoped. In a blur of movement that surprised Vrindari, the servant kicked away from him, then coiled his body back like a cat. Vrindari had just enough time to notice the berserker draw his weapon parallel to his body and pull his shield up to block him before the servant rocketed forwards. Mace dragging along the ground, leaving a trench in the dirt before being pulled upwards in an uppercut manner. Vrindari angled his shield low to block the strike. Then released a gasp of air as the blow sent him bodily into the sky. Vort let out a triumphant howl before charging after the shielder servant. Only to stop when a burst of lightning caught him in the side of the head. Releasing a hiss of pain as the yellow electricity scorched the side of his helm. Growling with rage, his head turned to see Solaire return his talisman to his belt and materialize his shield before the berserker was on him. Solaire widened his eyes behind his helmet as he threw his body into a roll, just underneath the berserker's strike, which impacted barely a second after he had moved, sending debris across the area in an explosion of dirt. Getting back to his feet, the saber span around, slashing his sword in an arc at the berserker's armor. The grinding of metal against metal had him frown as he watched his sword just grated against the armor on Vort's chest. The berserker released another roar before he was once again on Solaire. The accursed beast let out a wail of pain as the fireball impacted the side of its face, fur being set alight. The resulting wail also sent the corpses on the boy into a frenzy, limbs thrashing about and heads screaming in distress and rage. Ash recoiled in disgust, Ryder's lip curled in a similar expression at the creatures. Filthy things. She complained, absolutely vile to look at. Kill them then. Ash quickly retorted, charging up another pyromancy before flinging it towards the beast again. Ryder spared a quick glance at the fireball before dismissing it. Charging up her own spells in her hands. The accursed leapt into the air, avoiding the ball of fire, eyes burning with rage as it locked onto Ash. The servant rolled to the side as the creature slammed into the ground where he had last been. The move had been one born of animalistic rage to lash out at anything that had harmed it, and it showed. The second it had touched the ground, a whip of fire latched itself around the creature's neck. Its eyes widened in alarm as it strained to pull itself away. Ryder narrowed her eyes and held firm, all of her spiked legs digging into the ground to support her as the beast thrashed around, struggling against the leash. Ash swiftly returned to his feet. Gripping his sword with two hands, he slashed at the nearest leg to his body. the limb being severed just above the heel. The creature screamed, reorientating its body to try and accommodate for its missing limb. Raising itself up on its hind legs and trying to pull away from Ryder. "Here I come," leaving it open for Gareth and Sif. The Lancers shout, giving Ash just enough warning to throw his body to the side before the wolf and servant came shooting past him. Gareth with a wild grin on her face and lance extended outwards, Sif slammed into the torso of the beast. The force sending the creature reeling and would have been enough to knock it on its back. Had it not been for Gareth's lance penetrating straight through its chest and out the back of its body. The giant lance keeping it in place even as it screamed and thrashed around. Gareth's face showing only a slight amount of strain as the accursed continued to shriek to the skies. "Just die like the filth you are," Ryder huffed, pulling on the whip of fire with all her might. There was a sizzling sound of flesh being cooked followed by a tearing noise as the charged head was ripped from its body. A gurgling noise escaping the remains of the throat as black liquid trickled from the wound. The thrashings of the beast quickly tapered off, limbs falling uselessly at its side as Gareth flicked the body of the lance. Face soured with disgust. "Oh Lord, that smells horrible," she wailed. Ash was thankful that his dulled senses meant he was unable to corroborate her claims. "You're doing pretty well, Betty," Arash mused as he fired off another dozen arrows. The caster to his left thrust the catalyst forwards. Several bright blue projectiles were sent forth and towards the accursed, charging them. The creature snarled in pain when Arash's arrows impacted its head and eyes. Its snarl devolved into a wail as the sorceries burned holes through the creature's body. The sizzling of flash and burning of hair being overpowered by the sound of pain emanating from the monster. "I fight good when I'm stressed," Beatrice retorted in a somewhat panicked tone. "I'm actually very stressed right now." "It'll keep you on your toes." Arash chuckled, then steeled his expression as he pulled back his bow. The arrow being charged with enough power that it eventually burst into flames. Letting it loose, the projectile sailed forth with a thunderous boom. The accused's wails were silenced when the arrow hit, and vaporized half the creature's head. How many of those things are left? Arash wondered, sending a glance at the rest of the battlefield. He clicked his tongue and immediately drew back another arrow as he saw the third and final creature charging Mash and Ritska. Ritska blinked as he heard Mash's panicked cry. Reality came back to him. Boy, did he wish it hadn't. The first thing he saw was one of the monsters charging straight towards him, mouth split open and guttural roar emerging from its throat as it locked onto him. Mash! He instinctively cried. The lilac-haired girl allowed herself a brief feeling of relief that her senpai was at least aware of his surroundings again. She then focused her expression, engaging hostile. She cried, hand going to her new sword and ripping it free from its scabbard. She still wasn't particularly accustomed to sword fighting. Vrindari had only been able to drill in the basics, although she was fairly confident that she didn't need it in this situation when dealing with whatever these things were. She charged forwards at the same time the accursed righted itself, glowing eyes intensified and its maw widened to reveal its crooked and sharpened teeth, lunging towards Mash. The shielder girl changed the grip on her shield so it's held more like a lance, swinging it in a backhanded motion at the same time that the creature lunged at her. The shield smacked into the chin of the creature with a meaty thud, the blow snapping the head upwards and sending the beast stumbling. Taking advantage of the new position, Mash thrust the sword upwards into the neck, the blade sinking halfway into the accursed's throat before it got stuck. A gurgle-like growl emanated from the wounded opponent as it thrashed around. Mash's eyes widened in alarm as her feet left the ground, leaving her dangling in the air, hand still gripped on the sword stuck in the monster's neck. Wah! A panicked cry escaped her mouth as she was flung about, still hanging onto the sword. Ritska's fear slowly abated in favor of bewilderment at the sight of Mash hanging on for dear life as the creature bucked and thrashed around. Mash! Are you alright? Don't worry senpai. Mash called back, I've got it under control. Her last line was cut off as the creature flung its head upwards. Mash lost her grip on the sword and was sent helicoptering vertically in the air. As she sailed through the air, she felt gravity take a hold of her and she began to fall back to the earth. Looking down, she saw the creature ignore her in favor of turning its attention towards Ritska. Oh, shit, Ritska mumbled out, backing away as a guttural hiss emerged from the beast's throat. Senpai! Mash cried out in alarm as she fell, then put on a determined expression as she held her shield above her head. Plunging towards the ground, she thrust the shield down so the bottom point would make contact with the ground first. Or the creature's head in this instance. The cross-shaped shield slammed into the top of the accursed head, a cracking sound indicating that bone had been shattered as the skull caved inwards. The impact carried the beast further down into the ground, body smashing into the dirt and kicking up a cloud of dust. Ritska held his hand in front of his face as the debris blew past him. Lowering it, he saw Mash standing atop the remains of the creature's head. Panting before sending him a beaming smile, hostile defeated Senpai. Quote. Yeah. Ritska mumbled, eyes wide, gee, good work. Vrindari clenched his teeth as another blow smashed into his shield, the ground beneath his feet cracking. Solaire took advantage of Vort's tunnel vision and ran in, swinging his sword into the right underarm of the berserker. Vort released a cry of rage as he recoiled his arm, standing back on his weakened legs. Vrindari released a cry of exertion as he pushed Vort off of his shield. The berserker stumbled backwards as it tried to reorientate itself. I think not. Vrindari shouted, sword lit up with white lightning before he swung it upwards, releasing a ball which impacted the servant in the center of his chest. The berserker let out a cry of pain as it fell onto its back, thrashing like a flipped tortoise. Solaire charged forwards, raising his sword above his head to strike the servant again before it disappeared into thin air. He slid to a stop, staring down at where the servant had been before he clicked his tongue. It would seem his master recalled him. A smart move, if unfortunate for us. Vrindari sighed, then looked around. It would appear the beasts have been taken care of. Excellent. Solaire nodded his head, then looked over to see the Romans, still cowering behind Ritska. I am pleased to see they heeded my commands. You ordered them not to interfere. Vrindari surmised, smart. Against the spiders they may have held a chance. Against these foul beings. He shook his head. Indeed. Solaire nodded, however, I believe we have been afforded a brief respite. Indeed we have. The looking glass knight nodded his head. Come, we shall see how the others fared. So, Ritska coughed into his hand, looking away from the remains of the creatures. They were accursed. Ash spoke up, still crouched over the remains of the one Mash had crushed, fresh ones too. Wonderful. More monsters from home. Indeed. Ash nodded, then stood up again and moved over to Ritska. They are actually creations, as I'm sure you surmised. They are a form of familiars. Mash asked, surprise in her voice. I have no idea what that is. Ash shrugged, you recall my story of Aldrich. Yeah, cannibal bishop eats people, then gods. Ritska surmised, earning a surprised choke of air from everyone who hadn't heard it, ate some guy called Gwendolyn. Quote. He what? That came from Ryder, the woman gaping at him with a shocked expression, he ate him. Yeah. Ritska sighed. Sorry. A little panicked, so I'm being blunt right now. Understandable. Ash waved him off, but yes, these are the creations of Aldrich. So he's here then. Most likely. Ash clicked his tongue, and most unfortunate. Whatever else I think of him, he is still a lord of Cinder. He turned to Ritska, that makes him, how you would say, a divine spirit. Quote. Shit. Ritska sighed, palming his face, then he turned back to Solaire, so. How far are we from your base? A little over a day's journey. The Sun Knight broke out of his stupor and answered Ritska, unfortunately, we will likely have to camp out during the night. The spiders emerged during that period. Ritska's expression blanked, then he placed his head into his hands. Releasing a muffled scream. The group watched him wail into his hands for a few moments before he raised his head, clapping his hands together. All right. Let's go then. Are you all right, Senpai? Mash asked, taking a step forwards and reaching out to him. Ritska released a forced laugh. I'm really tired right now and, no offense to any of you, he gestured to the Romans, but right now, this place is a shithole. Quote. That's fair. Aulus agreed relatively easily. To be honest, we have worse things to say about it. The man sighed, still, I'll prepare the men. Prefect Solaire. He nodded his head and moved off to the group of Romans, the troops still regaining their breath. So, how long has this situation been going on? Ritska asked Solaire. The knight turned to him and scratched the side of his helmet in thought. When I was first summoned, a little over 3 weeks. He explained. Since then, I've been here for 2. He chuckled, turning to Ash. It's quite strange to be able to accurately tell the length of time one has been around, is it not? It's jarring. Ash agreed with a chuckle, turning to Ritska. Do you wish to ride Sif again? I think I've ridden him enough for one day. Ritska replied with an uneasy expression, turning to Mash. I think I'll walk. All right. Mash nodded her head with a smile. Ryder snorted. Mash shot her a glare, to which the rider responded with another amused smile. All right guys. Ritska cleared his throat. Let's move. The group continued their walk for nearly several hours in the most peculiar column of troops that could be seen. You. Undead. Were the words of the rider as she approached Ash. He looked away from his conversation with Solaire and towards her unusually serious expression. Unkindled. Ash replied. I don't care, you look like a corpse, stink like a corpse and fight like a corpse. She huffed. The difference between whatever you call yourself and the average stumbling hollow is of little concern to me. Ash huffed, then looked back to Solaire. We'll speak later. I look forward to it. Solaire nodded back, looking away to the front of the column as Ash slowed down to fall into step with the rider. And what has this corpse done to earn your attention? Oh demon. Ash asked her, crossing his arms. That pyromancy you used. She began, eyes narrowed. That was a chaos flame. It was. Ash admitted, chaos is useful for dealing with those of abyssal origins. He looked back at her, although I assume you are more curious as to how I wield it. That is an art of which few knew of. Ryder narrowed her eyes, and fewer still who would teach it. I discovered a tome in the smoldering lake. Ash answered honestly, I have little doubt that it is the ruins of old Izalith. After discovering it, I handed it to a pyromancer to translate it for me. That is all. Old Izalith, Ryder muttered looking away. Where? Ash stared up at her then away, at the foot of a corpse. Quote. I see. Ryder nodded, I'm Quelaag. I don't know who you are. Ash answered honestly, if that was your intent, what was the land called when you wandered upon it? Lordran. She replied, then narrowed her eyes when Ash released a bitter scoff. That would have been hundreds of thousands of years ago. He shook his head. In truth, I only knew what it was called because of a traveling companion had been there. And who was this companion? A slave knight. Ash replied, then sent her a sideways glance when she stilled. Yes, he had very choice words about the witch's machinations. He held a strong dislike of demons. Tch. Quelaag clicked her tongue, scowling, so they survived. Then frowned, hundreds of thousands of years. She looked away. Doesn't matter, I have my answer. Ash stared at her for a few more moments before looking away, if you say so. Also your use of chaos pyromancy is amateur at best. She said after a few more moments, it is quite honestly, one of the most pathetic things I've seen in my life. I'll stick with abyssal pyromancy then. What? She hissed, glaring down at him. You wield abyss so casually. Are you truly stupid? I'm more than careful. Ash shrugged. You fool. You're a dark wraith in the making. She sneered. You are either ignorant or stupid. I have seen what the abyss can do if left to run rampant. So have I. Ash replied, now glaring up at her, and do not preach to me the dangers of magic gone rampant. Chaos witch. He replied in a firm tone, it was not the abyss which birthed demons. You dare to lecture me. Quelaag scoffed, do not think me some narcissistic fool. We dabbled in chaos and all paid the price for it. Do not think that we did not suffer, or do you believe I chose to appear as a freak of nature? Do you think we chose to be undead either? Ash retorted, voice growing in intensity, dare not claim to me that you are not the victim of your own hubris. He jabbed a finger in her direction, it was not humans who cursed themselves or brought about the cycle. That was the gods. And what were the witches of Izalith attempting to do? Ash roared back, several heads turned back to look at the argument, another would-be lord who thought they should cling to power, or were you attempting to recreate the flame for the benefit of all? Guys. A tentative voice called out to the pair. What? Both heads snapped to the voice, Ritska flinched ever so slightly at being under their gaze. Purposefully avoiding looking at Quelaag. You all right here? Ash stared at him for a few moments before he exhaled. Forgive me, I allowed my emotions the better of me. He walked past Ritska nodding his head. I will attempt to avoid such a situation again. All right. Ritska replied, scratching the back of his head with a small frown. He hadn't seen Ash that upset by anything before. He'd never met Ryder, at least he didn't think so why was he so upset? Future conversations will be very inconvenient if you refuse to look at me. Ryder's voice called out from behind him, or do you plan to merely shut your eyes whenever my form enters your vision? I'm trying all right. Ritsuka replied, calling back over his shoulder, then sighing, not my fault I'm scared of spiders, he mumbled. It's your fault for not doing anything about it. Ryder huffed, although she was clearly still annoyed by her argument with Ash, you should watch that one. He dabbles in that which he does not understand. Ritsuka frowned, what do you mean? Of course you're too stupid to know. She sighed, then snorted, ask any of the others, ask the Sun Knight what the abyss is. You will receive your answer and then tell them that Ash wields it. See how they react. Ritsuka bit his lip. He suspected this was likely related to their world, and he didn't understand it. Although, abyss, sounded ominous whatever it was. Well, maybe Vrindari would know. Abyss. The shielder stared down at his master, tone sounding perplexed. Where did you hear of the abyss, my liege? Ryder mentioned it. He explained, then shrugged, I was kind of curious what it was. Quote. I would be a poor source of information. Vrindari admitted, I know little on the subject, save that it was something to be avoided. He hummed, Beatrice may know however. She spoke of a journey to Ulasil. That city suffered an outbreak of the abyss. Outbreak. Ritsuka frowned, like a plague. Possibly. Vrindari shrugged, however, I never encountered the abyss itself, nor do I believe any of the knights of Drangleic did. However, he paused, Esser Rame. He once accused Queen Nashandra of being abyss spawn. He looked away, I had thought it an insult, but perhaps, he shook his head, it matters little right now. Beatrice would know more. Thanks. Ritsuka nodded his head, giving the shielder a smile before he jogged over to the front of the column. Beatrice walking alongside Arash, the latter chuckling about something. Beatrice. He called out, the caster jolted, whirling around to see who had called her. She relaxed when she saw Ritsuka approach. Master. Beatrice bowed her head slightly, how can I help you? I wanted to ask about the abyss. Beatrice's whole demeanor changed in an instant, where had once been a nervous young girl, suddenly her eyes flashed and she straightened out her posture. Closing the distance between herself and the master almost instantly. For what purpose? She asked. Her tonal shift was so surprising Ritsuka nearly stumbled over his first words. The abyss. He repeated, I wanted to know about it. Ryder mentioned it and Vrindari said you might know about it since you traveled to Ulasil so. I understand. She sighed, giving a reassuring smile. Normally whenever someone asks about the abyss it's just to preach about how evil it is or the curses it inflicts. She shook her head, it's a bit more complicated than that. Oh. Ritsuka nodded his head. So, what is it? Beatrice frowned, biting her lip. I don't know all the details of it. The abyss is complicated. It exists as a place and as a substance. That doesn't make sense to me. The abyss as a place it currently resides outside the world. A separate existence more akin to one of the painted worlds. She trailed off. You have no idea what that is, do you? No. Ritsuka shook his head, a confused expression still on his face. Beatrice winced, frowning in thought. Just think of it as a world just outside of a world. Like a puddle next to a lake. I think I get that. He hesitantly nodded, although he still looked confused. Anyway. The abyss was said to have been born of primeval man. She went on, it was said to be an endless all-consuming void occupied only by dark wraiths which would consume all in its path. She shrugged, although that was the story perpetuated by the gods. She frowned, the abyss was said to actually be quite welcoming to those who did not have their power tied to the flame. Humans, who held the dark soul, could actually live there without fear of death. Really? Ritsuka blinked, looking quite surprised. I don't know. Beatrice shrugged, this is all hearsay and rumors. I died before I found out. Oh, he cringed, sorry about reminding you. It's fine. Beatrice waved him off. He cleared his throat, so, could someone wield abyss? Wield it? Beatrice looked incredulous, the only things which actually dabbled in the abyss were darkwraiths. And they consumed humanity, by that I mean souls of humans, I never heard of anyone using abyss. Because writer said that Ash was insane for using Abyss or Somethi. He uses Abyss. Beatrice squealed, face etched with joy. She said he can do that. Getting well within his personal space. Ritska stumbled backwards as Beatrice's face was scant centimeters from his own. A redness crept up his neck as he stumbled for an answer. Why yeah. Excuse me master. Beatrice virtually leapt away from him before sprinting down the column, furiously calling out Ash's name. Well, Arash spoke up, eyebrows raised as he walked up next to Ritska. I haven't seen Betty look so excitable. I don't know if I should be happy she's not stuttering or send my condolences to Ash that he is the focus of her newfound attention. Ritska cringed, she can't be that bad. He replied, more to convince himself than anything else. Although he was still left with confused as to what it all meant. Abyss huh? He muttered to himself. It sounded ominous and Darkwraiths sounded pretty nasty, consuming human souls. Was Ash like that? He didn't want to think so. The Saber servant had been nothing but friendly towards them and seemed repellent to the idea of consuming Olga's soul. But then he had said that undead like himself were made to consume souls, and he apparently wielded Abyss. Maybe he should ask Ash about it. Chaldia Pav. Anything. Da Vinci asked with a frown, still staring at the screen while Romani rested his head in his hands. Nope. He sighed, still no contact with them. The interference is too thick. I thought you said that their ray-shifting location was clear. Olga shouted at him, although her expression was bordering on nervousness as well. If it's so clear, how come we can't listen to them? It was clear when I ray-shifted them. Romani held up his hands in surrender, it was. But the second they arrived, the interference picked up and blocked all readings. TCH. Olga clicked her tongue, eyebrow twitching. How long has it been now? Currently. Da Vinci crossed her arms. Over 3 hours. Are they dead? No. Da Vinci shook her head. The Chaldia generator is still registering the servant's drain. She replied, a small smile on her face. They are still alive. But we can't make contact. Olga growled to herself, biting her thumb. This is a disaster. Mechanical error. Doesn't sound it. A voice replied from the door, group turning to see Uchelaine leaning against it with a frown. I'd say a trap. That would have been my guess as well. Da Vinci replied after a few moments, the rayshift coordinates were too convenient. So we sent them into an obvious trap. Olga threw up her arms, scowl on her face. We were desperate. Romani pointed out, the interference was all over Europe. Not enough to prevent communication, but enough to prevent accurate rayshifting. Quote. You said accurate. Olga spoke up after a few moments. Yes Romani trailed off, eyes going wide, you can't mean to. We're blind down there. She spoke up, expression set in a determined one, and we need eyes on the ground. So we wait. Romani exclaimed, you can't mean to rush off down there right now. What choice do we have? She fired back, all I need to do is get a servant and rayshift down there. You can't rayshift th. She can. Da Vinci piped up. Romani turned to her with a betrayed look. The rayshift into and out of Fuyuki proved it. She bit her lip, although your affinity as a master is rather terrible. Hey. Nah, she's right. Cu shook his head, it's actually horrible. I'm genuinely wondering if it's a curse inflicted on you. Enough of this. Olga stamped her foot. I'm going down there. Would I be able to make contact with them if I was down there? Maybe. Romani shrugged, but we don't even know what's down there. You could end up in a terrible situation and we'd have no way to get you back. Olga took in a deep breath. That's just something I'm willing to risk. I'm Chaldia's director. I need to act as one. Not a stupid scared little girl. Direct. Nice words. Cu grinned, strutting over to her and patting her on the back. You're getting better, lass. He turned back. I say she goes for it. Maybe she'll get a servant she can work with. Romani looked to Olga. Fine, he slumped his shoulders. I'm not planning on going to every singularity. Olga scoffed. I just need to ensure that our current operatives are still unharmed. So, to the summoning chamber. To the summoning chamber. The pillar of light flashed into the air, the group covered their eyes as it died down. Then they looked up. And up. And up. Quote. Shit. Cu whistled, he's a big one. The 9-foot metal servant turned its pointed helm towards the lancer and then back down towards the white-haired girl. Getting on one knee, but still towering over her. The servant was garbed in dark steel armor, scaled in its design with a pointed helm and frayed red hair jutting from the back. In its left arm it held a rounded shield and a giant axe in its right. I am your master, Olga announced, puffing out her chest. The servant stared at her, then nodded its head once. Well, he's probably a berserker. You shrugged. You checked his stats. Olga did. The widened her eyes. Oh. That's a lot of A's. She then looked at its personal skills. Oh, a form of golem. She raised an eyebrow, frowning, must be from the other world then. The magic resistance also wasn't great, only being ranked at AC, the same as the luck. However, with a in endurance and strength and AB in agility and mana, she wasn't going to complain. Da Vinci. She turned around to the caster. Get me ready for a ray shift. The giant rose from its crouched position. Looks like Mr. Protagonist has some competition. Da Vinci smirked, then giggled, unless you're concerned about him. He's my subordinate. Olga crossed her arms and huffed. He's not allowed to fail or die unless I allow it. A metallic groan emanated from the berserker. Olga smirked. See. Berserker agrees with me. Quote. I think that was just him moving his body. Quote. Just get me ready to ray shift. Olga taking matters into her own hands. It will probably be just for this singularity though. Maybe, who knows. Anyway. If no one could guess which servant it was. It's the Dragon Slayer armor. Here are his stats. Dragon Slayer armor. Servant. Berserker. Strength. A. Endurance. A. Agility. B. Mana. B. Luck. C. Noble Phantasm. A. Fulgur Cadence. A. Anti-unit max target. 1. Max range. 5. Charged with the power of lightning, the axe is slammed into its opponent with an explosion designed to crush and obliterate even the toughest of enemies. Class skills. Mad Enhancement. X. It is neither sane nor insane. Without a true will of its own, it functions as a complicated golem. What few original thoughts it has are few and far between. Magic resistance. C. Personal skills. Battle continuation. X. The armor must be destroyed. Even with the loss of the head, the suit will still continue to function. Golem. X. A suit of armor, only given sentience through retained memories of its previous wearer. Immune to forms of damage designed to kill living beings. Dragon Slayer. A. As far as dialogue goes. It's literally a living suit. It can't speak. Or think that much. That's what makes it so compatible with Olga. It doesn't have an opinion. Chapter 28. Hands-on approach. Chaldea Pav. Olga tried to get her breathing under control as she approached the rayshift chamber. Her first rayshift had been by accident into an area she wasn't prepared for. This was different. She knew she was going into a potentially hostile environment. So she shouldn't be so nervous about this. She even had a servant. Albeit the servant was a form of golem who couldn't speak, but it was a strong golem regardless. Therefore there was nothing to worry about. She was the director of Chaldea. She could do this. Rayshift in, find Master Candy. Find Ritsuka Fujimaru, help solve the singularity and then leave. Easy. She wasn't incompetent. She'd show everyone she could do it if she really wanted to. Yahoo! Astolfo's beaming face entered her field of vision. She stumbled back with a squeak of shock as the rider puffed out his chest and looked her up and down. Heard you were going down with a new servant, so I thought I'd wish you luck. I don't need luck. Olga retorted, looking away with a scoff. This operation requires skill. Relying on something as foolish as luck would be ludicrous for any competent professional. Astolfo raised an eyebrow at her, but simply shrugged. All right then. I'm still wishing you luck though. His smile never left his face as he turned to the berserker servant and gaped at him. Wow. You're big. He danced around the servant with an excited expression on his face. That's so amazing. You have this cool-looking axe and this big shield. Are you made out of metal? The berserker's head followed him around. Then he dematerialized his weapons and held out a hand to grab the rider on the shoulder. Astolfo didn't seem perturbed in the least. You have really big hands. Wow, they are cold too. The berserker stared down at him, its other hand raised above the boy's head and slowly descended until it rested atop his hair. The writer now looking perplexed by the action. Olga watched the servant incredulously, then the berserker did something unexpected. It pat Astolfo's head. Rather gently as well. It was, without a doubt, one of the most peculiar things she had ever seen in her life. Clearing her throat loudly, she got the attention of her servant again. The armored berserker turning to look at her, enough dawdling. We're going down to the rayshift chamber. The berserker nodded its head, then unhanded the boy and followed after his master. Astolfo stood in the corridor, still frozen with wide eyes and a slacked expression before he span around to face the retreating berserker and chased after him. No. Don't stop patting my head now. No one's done that to me in ages. The sounds of Olga's annoyed cry echoed through the corridors. So she's off then, is she? Sigurd asked. "Cu as the pair enjoyed a pint of Siegbräu in the pub. I will admit I am surprised by this. She did not strike me as the type to frequent the front lines." "Ah, just means she's growing." Cu grinned as he downed the drink greedily, slamming the mug back onto the table. "Holy shit, this stuff is great." "Thank you." Sigurd accepted the praise with a smile. "In truth, I am quite proud of it. Took many years to get the recipe just right." He sighed, and rather unorthodox use of miracles as well. Blessing fermenting fruit with a talisman is quite a hassle. Still, never would have guessed that you could make a drink this good with magic. Cu shrugged his shoulders. "Well, I suppose you could, but most mages would consider it a waste of time." "Their loss then." Sigurd chuckled. "Still, I had plenty of time on my hands as an adventurer. Traveling to different lands provided me with quite the menu of foods." "Really?" Cu titled his head, then frowned. "I assume you don't make most of them because of that undead thing." "Unkindled," he replied, shaking his head, "and I'm afraid so. Our senses have long since dulled. In truth, all we can eat and drink is Estus." He let out a quieter laugh. "Half the reason I tried so hard to make Siegbräu." That sucks. Cu comments, all levity gone from his voice as he held a rather somber expression, being robbed of the taste of food and drink. "It ain't right for a warrior." "Perhaps." Sigurd sighed, "although we never had much choice in the matter." He chuckled, then remained silent for a few moments. "I heard from Lady Da Vinci that we had a created world to train in which could replicate different locations." Cu nodded. "Yeah, they called it a simulator chamber or something." "Is that so?" He smiled. "A world forged by men. This might be as close as I get to a painted world." He clapped his hands. "Still, I was hoping you would do me the honor of a spar." Cu froze, his tankard barely touching his lips as he lowered it back to the table. Blank expression quickly giving way to a feral grin and a shine in his eyes. "Now that's something I can get behind. All this waiting about ain't good for us servants." "I agree." Sigurd nodded. "As much as I enjoy a rest, I do find myself in need of stimulation." He chuckled, rising from his seat. "Shall we?" "After you, big guy." The lancer servant downed the rest of his drink and wiped his chin, turning to the man in charge of the pub. "Barkeep. Have a pair of this guy's brew ready for when we return." "My name's Francis." The man muttered under his breath, but nodded his head as the two servants walked out of the room. "Do you want to see Lady Olga off first?" Sigurd asked. Lancer nodded his head. "Yep." Still grinning, "From what I understand, this will be the first time she's intentionally charging into battle. Hell if I'm gonna miss that. Let us be away." "How's the suit?" Da Vinci asked, Olga idly scratching her shoulders as she wore the Mystic Code uniform. The caster having prepared a special one for her in the style of her usual outfit. She frowned, narrowing her eyes. "It fits perfectly." She gave Da Vinci a suspicious glance. "Too perfectly." Da Vinci grinned. "Never underestimate a genius." Her eyes glinted with amusement. "Also, I got your measurements while you were being moved into your doll body." "You wah. Told you she was still here." Came the boisterous voice of Cu as he marched into the room, grin on his face as Sigurd followed behind him. "Oh." Da Vinci giggled, "Here to see off the brave heroine." "Indeed." Sigurd laughed. "I would be remiss if I did not offer Lady Olga good fortune in her journey." He looked over to the berserker servant and tilted his head. "Most unusual design of armor. We suspect he comes from your world." "Really?" Sigurd raised his eyebrows. "I'm sorry to say I do not recognize him." "It's a living suit." Olga huffed, shaking her head. "Besides, I don't need luck." I have, she trailed off, trying to think of something to say. Determination. CU offered helpfully with a carefree expression, an easy-to-tease face. Yes. She nodded, then widened her eyes in horror and blushed, and no. Pointedly proving the Lancer correct as he burst into laughter, Sigward releasing a quiet chuckle of her own. Olga growled, then sent a glance at Berserker. The armored giant stared down at her unmoving. Can we just hurry up? Olga huffed, crossing her arms and looking away. All right. Da Vinci eased up, leading Olga over to one of the spare coffins. Just stand in here and we'll send you down. She explained, then looked over to Berserker. You are slightly too big, my friend, so you'll have to stand outside the coffin. Quote. You mean we don't actually have to stand in them? CU spoke up, raising his eyebrow. Da Vinci shrugged, it's actually mostly for those with physical bodies. You're technically already spiritrans, so the coffins are unnecessary for you. It just makes the process a little easier. Huh. CU scratched his chin. That's fair. He looked over to Sigward. Well, we've wished you luck. Make sure you and this big guy kick some ass for us. He grinned as he and Sigward walked away, the saber calling out to her over his shoulder. I have faith in your abilities, Lady Olga. Return victoriously. We shall celebrate. With that, the door closed. Olga had a deceptively blank face at the servant's declaration before she let out a scoff. Celebrate. I haven't even done anything yet and he's already talking of celebrations. She scowled, and what is it with luck? What we need is competence and skill. Not luck. Da Vinci watched her rant with a small smile on her face, eventually placing a hand on the director's shoulder. Olga whirled on her with an incredulous expression. What? You'll do fine. She replied, her usual bright tone replaced with a softer one. We're here to back you up if you need it. Olga stared at her for a few minutes then huffed, stepping into the coffin. Just tell Romani to get ready to reshift. Da Vinci nodded her head, jogging out of the room. Director. Romani's voice came over the intercom. I'm just letting you know that interference might not get you to where we want you to go. But don't worry. You'll likely end up within a few miles of where we want to send you. Fine. Olga called back. Just hurry up, we're wasting time. All right. Romani replied. Just hope she doesn't materialize hundreds of feet above the ground. Wait, what? Olga shouted back in a panic. What do you mean? Romani. This thing is still on. Romani cried. And no, you'll be fine. Everything is under control here. No problems. His muffled voice came next. Quick, send her down. No, answer the question. Roman. The reshift announcement cut her off as she and Berserker disappeared in a flash of light. Romani slumped in his chair, nervous expression on his face. Hey, Doc. Maxwell called out to him, the reshift operator swiveling around in his chair. You think she's gonna materialize in the air? No chance. Romani shrugged him off with a shaky expression. The odds are so slim you'd have to be incredibly unlucky for something like that to happen. She'll be fine and she won't get mad at us. Quote, comma, quote. Quote, comma, quote. Quote, dot, dot, dot. She's going to materialize in the air, isn't she? Romani's head made contact with his desk. Probably, came his depressing muffled reply. Quote, dot, dot, dot. She's going to kill us. Romani groaned into his desk. His despair-filled wail was shared by the other operators in the room. His eyebrows furrowed as he looked up again. By the way, has anyone seen Fu? Olga Pav. Ah. Olga's cry of fear disturbed the silence of the area, if it could have been heard over the sound of rushing wind as she plummeted to the ground. She swore, if she somehow survived this, she would make Romani suffer. Be Berserker. She cried out in a panic, curling herself up into a ball as she fell. The armored giant grabbed her body and pulled him close to his chest, holding his shield out in front of him to take the impact of the ground. The descending lump of metal smashed into the earth with enough force to send debris in all directions and kick up a dust cloud large enough to cover both their forms. Olga's body jolted with the thud, ears ringing and limbs numb as she crawled out from the berserker's grasp and rolled onto the ground. Vomiting violently, she quickly descended into a hoarse cough, while weeping at the same time. The berserker watched her, albeit rather pathetic, display without moving. Still crouched over. When she eventually stopped coughing, she rose to her feet. stumbling about before leaning on her servant to steady herself and prevent her legs from giving out underneath her. She panted heavily, panic quickly giving way to fury. I'll kill that stupid, useless, worthless, lazy, pathetic, son of a bi. Ahem. A voice brought her out of her rant. She looked up to see she was surrounded by nearly 100 armed soldiers. All of which were Roman in design. Most looked like they had only just stopped what they were doing to surround her. She paled rapidly. Berserker rising from his crouched position and manifesting his axe, standing protectively in front of Olga. The sight of the armored giant sent murmurs through the ranks of the soldiers, many backing away, although a few looked caught between outright fleeing or attacking. State your name and your intentions, woman. The centurion asked, eyes darting between her and the berserker nervously. She swallowed, standing up and puffing out her chest. I am Olga Marie Animosphere from Chaldea. The centurion stared at her for a few minutes, scrunching his face up in confusion and then looking around to the other soldiers. Several shrugged, at which point he looked back at her. Never heard of it. So, Olga. He narrowed his eyes, hand resting on his sword. State your intentions before I have the men cut you down. A metallic groaning emanated from Berserker, his head tilting down to look at the centurion, causing the man to sweat, rather heavily, under the intense gaze of the giant. We're here to help. She huffed, looking at the man with a schooled expression. Completely ignoring her introduction of dropping out of the sky. That why you landed in our camp and nearly crushed several soldiers. The centurion scowled. But you said you were here to help. Yes. I have subordinates already here doing the same. He frowned, then sighed. Not like we can deny it. We need all the help we can get. He looked up at Berserker, that and your giant hasn't immediately started murdering us all yet. Like I said. Olga repeated, sounding more annoyed this time, we're here to help. Right. The centurion took his hand off his sword, waving for the others to stand down. Berserker relaxed after a nod from Olga, well. Welcome to Rome. Olga's eyebrows raised, this is Rome. Yeah. He shrugged, it's a few thousand paces up the road. He scratched his helmet, we're only here because the Emperor's new court magician said to expect help to arrive around this place. He looked up, although I wasn't expecting it to drop out of the sky. Must be a gift from the gods. A relieved smile came to his face. Olga, however, focused on something else. What do you mean we were expected? The Emperor's new court magician, and consort. The centurion repeated, she has the gift of foresight. She said that help would arrive to deal with the crisis. Clairvoyant. Olga muttered under her breath, then frowned, can you take me to her? The Emperor wanted to meet those who help anyway. The man shrugged his shoulders, we weren't sure what to expect, which is why we brought a small detachment. His posture relaxed, but since you're here, we can provide escort, not that you need it, but it'll probably put everyone else at ease if you are seen with a guard. Olga bit her thumb, holding up her hand. One moment. She pressed her communicator, the blue screen flashing up, Fujimaru, report. Mash. She clicked her tongue in annoyance, Romani. Rector. You're all right. Came Romani's relieved voice as his face appeared, and we can read you just fine. You're an idiot, was her blunt response. I materialized in the air. Quote. Oh. I can't make contact with Fujimaru or Mash. She scowled. They must still be in the zone of interference. She looked back at the Romans briefly, then back to Romani. Regardless, the Romans were here when I arrived. They appear to have a clairvoyant who foresaw our arrival. Romani blinked in surprise. Whoa. That would have to be some powerful clairvoyant. Who is it? I don't know. She hissed. However, I'm being escorted to meet the Emperor. Continue trying to make contact with Fujimaru and Mash. I'll report back when I meet with the Emperor. All right. Romani nodded. Be careful. I don't need safety advice from you right now. Romani winced. Olga clicked the communicator off and looked back to the Romans, who all seemed nonplussed about her communicator. The centurion stared at her, then shrugged. Prefect Solaires is more impressive. Was all he could say. Are you prepared to depart, Lady Olga? Let's go. True enough, Olga had actually been quite fortunate to materialize only a few miles from Rome itself. It was close enough that she would be there by the evening. While she was still bitter about materializing in the air of all things, she could at least count her blessings that she was close to a source of information. That, and to be able to speak with a powerful clairvoyant who had accurately been able to foresee her arrival was not something she was going to pass up. They needed actual information. Whether Lev was working alone or not. Her thoughts turned bitter when she thought back to the man. He'd been one of the few pillars of support she had ever had in her life, and he denounced her as a failure and a fool. And he was right. She had failed. The world had been incinerated and she hadn't even noticed it. The facility was sabotaged and most of her master candidates were on the verge of death. She really was worthless, wasn't she? Her shoulders slumped, eyes turning downcast. She was the director of Chaldea, she was supposed to lead by skill and example. And here she was, traipsing around a potentially world-ending singularity because she wanted to reclaim her pride that she could do at least one thing right. What a stupid childish notion that was. She blinked as she felt a hand on her back. Turning around and looking up, she saw that berserker was staring down at her, arm extended to give her a comforting pat on the back, or as best as the servant could manage. She almost let out an incredulous laugh there and then. Am I really so pathetic I need an actual golem to comfort me? The berserker removed its hand from her back, as if it had been a fleeting impulse and turned its head back towards looking ahead. She did her best to put on an air of composure and self-assurance. She was going to meet an emperor and clairvoyant. She needed to appear confident. She needed to demonstrate Chaldea's resolve to these people. And to herself. She froze when something warm passed up her back towards her neck. It was small, and felt fluffy, followed by a muffled cry. She instinctively scrambled her arms to the back of her neck to try and find whatever it was, when something burst from her collar and landed on her shoulder. Foo! The little white creature stared at her, she stared back in shock. What the foo? Elsewhere Pav. That was a complete failure. Lev huffed, a dissatisfied expression on his face showing his disappointment in the situation, however his tone indicated he hadn't been surprised in the least. Your affirmations as to our lack of progress are a welcome addition. Demon. Aldrich retorted, and it was not a complete failure. He reminded, a grin coming into existence on the puppet corpse, we are now aware of the forces Chaldea fields. And all it cost were several familiars and the element of surprise. Lev went on, unimpressed, that undead saber recognized you. Aldrich froze, corpse body slowly craning down towards Lev. Do not tell me what I already am aware of. I recognize the saber as well. He is a nameless unkindled and of no consequence. Impressive bluster. Lev gave a faux clap. I'm sure it was even more impressive before he killed you. Aldrich's body released a growling noise as it snaked around the room. Do not test my patience. He hissed, voice of the puppet body being mixed with his own in a disturbing echo. The circumstances are different. I will not be denied a second time. He craned up, not when I'm so close. Lev stared at the creature with half-lidded eyes before looking away, as you say. Still, I would be remiss if I didn't do anything to ensure your victory over the Chaldeans. Another servant. Aldrich crossed his arms. Do as you wish. As long as they obey my commands, I care not. And as long as you obey the king's commands, I care not. Lev replied in an equally disinterested tone as the grail in his hands flashed with light. A pillar of energy shot forth from the floor upwards, the light illuminating the room before it died down. As it did, the form of a man was revealed. Clad in a long, light gray cassock with a similarly colored shoulder cape, on his back between the two cloths hung a blue rectangular piece of fabric with an ornate white design embroidered into it. Underneath the coat was chainmail armor. On his hands were elbow-length black leather gloves, wearing dark leather trousers with brass-colored shin guards atop brown leather boots. The man's face could be described as handsome, sharp features on his face set in a stern expression with long black hair extending past his shoulders. On his back hung a large sheath for a great sword. His eyes opened to reveal dark hazel orbs, a rich voice escaped his throat, servant. Foreigner, I have answered your call. They flickered over Aldrich, lips curling in disgust before they went to Lev. Where they then went wide, the man backing off and hand instantly going for his sword. Filth. He hissed, gripping the blade and ripping it free of its scabbard, pointing it at the demon in disguise. You dare hide behind the form of man. I can see you have a certain insight. Lev drawled, looking back at the Grail with a raised eyebrow. Now then. What can it tell me about you? He hummed as the information filtered through his head. A smile came to his face, he sent Aldrich a glance, despite first appearances, he'll do nicely. Oh. Aldrich chuckled, learned something did you? I did indeed. His grin turned shark-like, I need only use your noble phantasm to make you more agreeable. The foreigner servant's eyes went wide, no. I am no beast. He howled, charging Lev ready to cleave him in two. He didn't get far before being tackled by several spiders, the arachnids doing little to prevent him as with refined movements he slew them in rapid succession. However, the spiders succeeded in their mission. By the power of Command Seal. Lev grinned, let the spirit of man leave you, let a great terror replace your flesh, become an unsightly beast. Let yourself be accursed. The man stopped, blade just shy of striking Lev, before he keeled over. Screaming in pain as his body began to writhe and contort. Skin split as extra limbs forced themselves from his body, bones snapped and were extended, flesh turned a sickly gray color. That is quite unsightly. Lev chuckled as if seeing something amusing. By the end of the transformation, the abomination stood up, towering over both Lev and Aldrich, eyes tinted with madness. More agreeable now, aren't you? The beast gave no reply, still staring at Lev. I see, Aldrich spoke, a newfound tone of intrigue, to think a creature could be born without the abyss. Quite disturbing. He looked over the servant with something akin to childlike curiosity. What a fascinating form, and yet I sense such power. Yes. You shall do nicely. What was his name? Oddly enough it was a German one. Lev shrugged, yet there is certainly no mention of something like this in human history. Quite disgusting. Perhaps another world, I would say they are proving an annoyance, but if they produce servants like these I cannot complain. He seemed to moral before. Aldrich laughed, but it always the noblest of individuals who fall the furthest. The suffering they feel as a result of their failures is most exquisite to look upon. Lev rolled his eyes, yes, most amusing. He sighed, how do you plan on using this one? Oh. I shall find a use for him. Fujimaru Ritsuka Group Pav. Soler held up his hand to stop the column. Arash stood next to him with narrowed eyes. You see something? The saber asked him. About 20 Roman soldiers approach us. He replied, looking at Soler, friends of yours. Ah. Soler sounded pleased, Centurion Magnus. I had him remain behind without equipment we could not take into the forest, along with a small detachment of men. If we did not return, he was to ride back. Friendly then. Arash smiled, that's good. They carried provisions. Soler offered, while we servants may not need to eat, and undead such as myself cannot taste it, I cannot say the same for the humans in our quarry. I'll say. Arash chuckled, looking back towards the rest of the group, we've got some friendly soldiers approaching us with supplies. Food and shelter. Ritsuka called back. Arash looked at Soler, the knight nodded once. Yeah. That's good. Ritsuka let out a breath of relief, I think me and the others are getting tired. Boy, Aulus stood near Ritsuka, an amused smile on his face, your stamina is terrible. He pointed at Mash, she has been carrying around her shield and fighting with it and she still looks spry. She's different. Ritsuka huffed, besides, I exercise plenty. Just never prepared for cross-country sprints away from monsters before. Neither did I. Aulus retorted, gesturing to himself, and I've been running for nearly a whole day, I've only just gotten tired. That might be your old age, sir. One of the men joked, walking past him. Fuck you, Felix. Aulus huffed, although the insult lacked any genuine meaning to it, this old man is still spry enough to beat your height in training. As you say, Centurion. Felix raised his hands, staring back at Ritsuka, still, maybe we should get our new friend to join in. Looks like he could use the workout. Ritsuka paled, well as beneficial as it would be for my liege to hone his physical body. Verndari interrupted, placing a hand on Ritsuka's shoulder, I fear as though your training would be too rigorous for him at his current health. Rest assured that I will put my utmost into his training however. Huh. Makes sense. Aulus replied, he doesn't look like a soldier. He frowned, but he doesn't look like some senator's son either. He shrugged, not my problem though. He could be from some barbarian hovel in Gaul and I wouldn't give a shit. You're all apparently here to help us, so I can't complain. Alright. Ritsuka nodded his head. Optio Felix. Aulus spoke to the slightly shorter Roman, with me. It seems that Prefect Soler has made contact with Centurion Magnus. Yes, Centurion. Felix nodded, the pair walking off to the front of the column. They do speak truly, however. Vrindari said after a few moments, looking down at Ritska, you could use training for your stamina. Probably. Ritska replied, looking slightly sheepish, although I don't think any training in my physicals is going to help me keep pace with you. It won't. Vrindari admitted, but it is important nonetheless. If for no other reason than ensuring you live a healthy life. Quote. You sound like my mother. Ritska joked, she's always going on about that. Quote. Sounds like my mother. Vrindari shrugged, although something tells me yours did not beat you with a stick to ensure you actually trained your body. What the heck? No. Ritska looked horrified at the idea, yours did. When my father wasn't around to anyway. Vrindari shrugged, sounding almost wistful, they always did want me to try hard. That was their way of motivating me. My father would tell me that if I didn't block or avoid his strikes, he would keep beating me. He shook his head, chuckling, I miss them. That's horrible. Is it? Vrindari sounded confused, they wanted what was best for me, and I admit that it gave me an edge over the other squires when I joined. Ritska was still staring at him in shock, he hadn't really expected the man to say his parents literally beat him into shape. Sure, his mother would gripe on about him, which is why he started exercising, but she never outright did something like that. Vrindari looked on ahead. It appears that Squire Kyrillite is still speaking with the demon. He huffed, filthy thing. He muttered under his breath. Ritska subconsciously winced at the mention of Ryder. It wasn't that he'd even spoken to her that much. It was just that he was far too scared of spiders to even approach her. Although Mash seemed to lack that same restraint. He was a little jealous of her in that regard. Mash and Quelaag Pav. And this inventor, Quelaag went on, brows furrowed, she can truly make clothes resistant to flames. Maybe not the flames themselves. Mash replied, but she can definitely make it resistant to the heat. Quelaag hummed in thought, resting her chin on her hand as she mulled over the suggestion, I am due to disappear when this singularity is over. It would be a waste. We could make it for you in case you come to Chaldea. Mash replied with a small smile. The same place as all those puffed up knights and a potential Darkwraith. She scoffed, I think not. Mash looked down, sorry. TCH. Quelaag huffed and looked away, don't look so depressed. It's disgusting to look at. Sorry. Stop apologizing too. She crossed her arms, frowning, you're a knight. At least act the part. Insult me, say you'll slay me, do something other than act like a handmaiden. But, why though? Mash asked, looking up at Quelaag curiously, you're helping us. Saying mean things about you would be wrong. Quelaag stared back at her for a few seconds before she sneered at her. You are, without a doubt, the worst knight I've ever met. I'm a monster. You should want to kill me on principle. But that seems wrong. Mash frowned, shaking her head. You might look different, but you aren't actually a monster, are you? She smiled. You're helping us and help those Romans. That's not very monstrous, is it? Quelaag released a huff of air from her nose and looked away. Honestly, remind me too much of her, she muttered under her breath. You're a terrible knight, girl. She shrugged, you're also an idiot. I'm helping them so I don't die. That doesn't make me any less monstrous. Quote. Do you want to be seen as a monster? What? Because, you look lonely. Quelaag's eyes briefly widened before they narrowed, her lips curling downwards in a frown before she looked away. What do you know about how I look? Maybe I just don't want to waste my time speaking with fools. She waved Mash away, leave me, go play with your master. I dread to think what notions of chivalry that steel-plated oaf is instilling in him. Mash hesitantly backed away from the rider, then moved back towards her master. Not before casting a fleeting glance back at Quelaag. There was something about the rider that Mash was curious about. She said she despised proper knights, but then said that Mash was a terrible one. So, did that mean she liked her then? One thing she could settle on was that Ryder was confusing. So Olga is now in the Singularity and we have name-dropped Aldrich and one other servant. A foreigner servant with connections to an eldritch god, a German name and transforms into a monster. Anyway. Aldrich's stats and dialogue. Aldrich, devourer of gods. Servant, caster. Strength, C. Endurance, A. Agility, E. Mana, A. Luck, C. Noble phantasm, B. Deus comedenti, C. Anti-unit max target, 1. Max range. 0 to 10 will wrap itself around target to consume them. Skills and knowledge are acquired. May utilize weakened versions of target's noble phantasm. Deep Moon Shadow, B. Anti-team max target, 50, max range, 0 to 40. Uses a perverted version of Gwyndolin's noble phantasm, fires bow into sky and calls down rain of arrows which follow targets. Life Hunt Scythe, B. Anti-divine, max target, 1, max range, 0 to 2. It is not actually the scythe itself. Rather a spell designed to emulate its effects. It is ranked down from the original, but is no less dangerous. Class Skills. Item Construction, B. Territory Creation, A. Lord of Cinder, A. Lit the first flame and continued the Age of Fire. As a Lord of Cinder he has protection against attacks of a spiritual kind. Equal ranking to divinity. Personal skills. Saint of the Deep, A. High knowledge of curses and abyssal sorcery. Consumer of the divine, X. Divine spirits are naturally weak to him. Clairvoyance, A+. Capable of seeing the present and the future. However is ranked down from X as it can only be accessed when Aldrich is dreaming. Summoning. Interesting, to think you would call me forth to save humanity. Ha 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 ha, most interesting. Still, it would be remiss of a saint not to aid his followers. Dialogue 1. I am also one for planning. But do not dally, summoner. If I wait too long, I may start to get hungry. Dialogue 2. A master and servant relation. Oh, foolish little morsel. You are my acolyte now. You confirmed it when you summoned me. Dialogue 3. Do I care how I am perceived? I am myself, because I could see the grander picture. Fretting over the views of morsels is beneath me. Dialogue 4. If you have divine spirits. There is a certain taste in the air. A most succulent flavor. Ah, lords, is it? Why, summoner, you should have told me you had meals prepared. Perhaps their unfamiliar nature to me will add a certain spice to the taste. Dialogue 5. If you have nameless king. He hates me, quite amusing. Although it is also amusing how he abandoned his family first, whatever occurred to his relatives after should be none of his concern. Dialogue 6. If you have ashen one. Foul unkindled who ruined all. I would have lived in the era of deep seas. Years of waiting and preparation wasted because of it. If this thing did not leave a lingering taste of ash, I would consume it. Dialogue 7. If you have Gwendolyn. I can see the way he flinches whenever he stares at me. Oh, it is most amusing. Let me tell you a secret, master. Gwendolyn still lives. No. I'm not speaking of the one you have, ha 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 ha. Dialogue 8. If you have Pontiff Sullivan. My ever loyal servant. One who understands the value of the deep. Although even I cannot match his hatred of the gods, or rather he can only hate them because he knows not else. Such an empty thing he is. Dialogue 9. If you have Priscilla. I saw her in a dream once, long ago. A little girl alone with monsters in a cold wasteland. How fitting that the being who could have killed the gods, in some way served the one who could devour them. Dialogue 10. If you have Gravelord Nito. I do avoid him, yes. I saw the first of the dead in a dream once, and he saw me. Likes. What I like. Power, growth, and domination. If you can rise above the others, you should. Assert your dominance of the weak, as is your right. Hates. Hates. Weakness. Those who cannot survive the progression the world do not deserve to live. Wish for the Holy Grail. I will perfect myself with my own will. Not with a chalice of some power. Bond level 1. Eating you as you are now is a waste. No better than a light meal. Blonde level 2. Yes. I can see some potential here. Perhaps you are not a meal just yet, but perhaps you are. We shall see. Blonde level 3. You prove useful so far. HMPH, continue to do so, morsel. Bond level 4. I should congratulate you, you are no longer worth eating. Instead, perhaps you have a different use. Bond level 5. You hold power over me. I can acknowledge that. But do not get too cocky, morsel, you are only useful for so long. Birthday. Why tell me? Unless. I suppose sufficiently aged meat does taste better, although the freshest is always the best. Perhaps I should act before you become too old. During an event. Perhaps I shall prove my dominance. First ascension. Ah, this feeling of power. You perform well, morsel. Second ascension. Continue to strengthen me, but do so at your own peril. Third ascension. You continue. Well done, acolyte, your usefulness shines through yet again. Fourth ascension. Ha 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 ha. This feeling. With this, I could consume the gods themselves. Well done, acolyte.